Thank you for your interest in the Proteus Consortium. This consortium aims to optimize the use of patient-reported outcomes to ensure that the patient's perspective is effectively captured and can be used to inform research and practice. In this presentation, we focus on ways of optimizing the graphic displays of PRO findings from clinical trials. I'm Michael Brundage, co-PI of the Proteus Consortium, and I have the privilege of making this presentation today along with Dr. Claire Snyder, the project PI. I'm a practicing radiation oncologist and professor of oncology at the Queen's University Cancer Research Institute in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. And Dr. Snyder is a professor of medicine, oncology, and health policy and management at the Johns Hopkins Schools of Medicine and Public Health. Proteus was initially funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute and has continuing funding from Genentech. This is one of a series of presentations about Proteus and the tools and resources available to optimize the use of PROs in clinical trials. The Proteus Consortium aims to achieve this optimization by promoting best practices across the continuum of the clinical trial lifecycle, including optimizing the trial protocol with respect to its PROs, selecting the appropriate pro measure or measures, conducting statistical analyses that are appropriate for the trial pro-specific objectives, reporting the trial results appropriately, and communicating the results for use in clinical practice. In this presentation, we provide an overview of the consensus-derived and evidence-based strategies to optimize the display of PRO data results from clinical trials. This is one of 6 presentations that will provide overviews for each of the Proteus tools shown on this slide. In other presentations, we provide an overview of each of the tools individually and also provide a broad overview of all the Proteus tools. Available presentations are posted on the Proteus website, shown as a subtitle here, theproteusconsortium.org. Although the focus of this presentation is on guidance for PRO data display, displaying the data is only one component of overall best practices for reporting the pro results of a clinical trial, as summarized by the Consort Pro Guidance Statement. We developed this guidance in order to promote consistent data presentation, arguing that consistent data display will facilitate clinician and patient familiarity with PRO findings and will therefore promote their understanding. These guidance recommendations were published in the journal Quality of Life Research in 2019. And on this slide, we gratefully acknowledge the other members of the project team, our stakeholder advisory board, and the invited participants in the Delphi consensus process. The impetus for developing these guidance recommendations was the evidence that shows that while both patients and clinicians endorse the value of PROs, they also report challenges in interpreting the meaning and implications of the PRO data, such as these typical clinical trial results shown here. The current literature also makes clear the many barriers that clinicians and patients describe in trying to interpret PRO findings, including variation in the pro instruments themselves, variation in how these instruments are scored and scaled, and variation in how the pro data are presented. In sum, these variations in how pro measures are scored and scaled make interpretation difficult and limit patients' and clinicians' use of the data in clinical practice. Clear, standardized graphical presentation of the pro data can promote meaningful interpretation and facilitate the use of pro findings in clinical practice. Therefore, this research tool is designed to provide evidence-based recommendations for PRO data display to facilitate ease of interpretation when results are presented to patients, for example, in educational materials or decision aids, and to clinicians and researchers, for example, in peer-reviewed publications. Parenthetically, the tool also addresses recommendations for displaying of individual patient pro data in the clinical practice setting, although these recommendations are not covered in this presentation. Finally, a word about the methods we use to develop these recommendations. They were developed using a modified Delphi process to establish consensus among a multidisciplinary group of stakeholders on a series of draft recommendations. We conducted a pre-meeting webinar to review the evidence base that would inform these recommendations and a pre-meeting survey relevant to this application. We then conducted a face-to-face meeting to develop draft consensus recommendations, and finally used a post-meeting survey to assess endorsement of the final recommendations made. When making these recommendations, we were cognizant that they should work on paper, that is, in a static presentation, and they should also be interpretable in grayscale, although presentation in color is possible and sometimes preferred. We recognized additional functionality in electronic presentations was possible, but this is not part of our standard recommendations. I'll now hand over to Dr. Snyder, who will present our guidance recommendations.
Because the evidence suggests that patients and clinicians desire differing levels of detail in the graphic displays, separate recommendations are made for presentation to patients in, for example, educational materials or decision aids, and for presentation to clinicians in, for example, peer-reviewed publications. This presentation provides a basic overview of the recommendations for both patient and clinician audiences. For each topic, we provide a general summary of the recommendation, followed by an illustrative example for a patient audience and an illustrative example for a clinician audience. A more detailed description of the recommendations is available in the presentation, displaying pro results graphically, applying the recommendations for those who are interested. One of the key issues to address in the presentation of pro data is how to display variations in directionality. That is, how to aid interpretation when higher scores are better for some domains, such as physical function, but worse for other domains, such as pain. There are two general recommendations for addressing directionality. First, the graphic should include exceptionally clear labeling, titling, and annotations to help viewers understand whether higher scores are better or worse. Second, domains that differ in scoring directionality should be presented separately. Here's an example of how to display data for patients. Before getting into specifics on the scoring directionality issue, we wanted to orient you to a few aspects of the presentation. First, we use a line graph of average scores over time, which was the preferred approach for showing longitudinal data. Different colors are used for the two treatment arms, and the lines are labeled directly, rather than using a legend. As for directionality, you can see that under each domain title, a header describes whether a line going up indicates improvement or worsening. The functional domains where higher scores are better are clearly separated from the symptom domains where higher scores are worse. Finally, we have included descriptive labels on the y-axis to help with directionality, as well as to help convey score meaning, which we will get to in a bit. Here's an example of how to display data for clinicians or researchers. Again, we use line graphs of average scores over time, but these versions include additional statistical and other details we will describe later. These graphs are shown in black and white, which remains common for journal publications, and for printers that clinicians and researchers may have access to. As with patients, the lines are labeled directly rather than using a legend. The same labeling, titling, and annotations are included here, such as the headers under the domain names, the separation of domains with different scoring directionality, and the y-axis labels. The next recommendations relate to conveying score meaning. That is, how to understand whether a score is good or bad, or what level of function or symptoms is represented. As mentioned previously, the recommendations suggest including descriptive labels along the y-axis to the extent that this information is known. In displaying the data, inclusion of reference values for comparison populations may also be considered. Here again is the illustrative example for displaying data for patients, highlighting the descriptive labels along the y-axis. As just mentioned, the labels along the y-axis should only be included when evidence supports where on the scoring continuum the labels should be placed. The consensus panel acknowledged that it would be easier to place the anchor labels, for example, none and severe, at the extremes of the continuum, and that it might be more difficult to place the middle labels, for example, mild and moderate. This is the clinician and researcher example illustration. The same considerations regarding the y-axis labels apply, with potentially greater knowledge and ability to include the anchor labels compared to the middle labels. The next recommendations address normed scoring. As you are likely aware, some questionnaires are normed with, for example, a score of 50 representing the general population average. The consensus panel recommended displaying the scores based on the questionnaire scoring metric, whether it be normed or not. They considered displaying the actual norm optional. This example shows normed scoring for display to patients. It does display the general population average of 50, as well as including the y-axis descriptive labels. As with the non-normed scoring, these labels should be placed based on where evidence suggests they belong. And this slide shows the normed scoring for display to clinicians and researchers with the same annotations. How to indicate whether differences between treatment arms are clinically important is another issue included in the recommendations. While the consensus panel felt that it is important for patients to know whether differences are clinically important, there was insufficient evidence regarding how best to convey this information. For clinicians and researchers, the recommendation is to use some symbol, but not an asterisk given its common use to indicate statistical significance, to indicate which differences are clinically important. In this illustrative example for clinicians and researchers, a cross is used to indicate the time points where the differences are clinically important, and the meaning of this symbol is included in the figure legend. Finally, while evidence suggests that many patients do not want statistical information included and find this information confusing, many clinicians and researchers were interested in statistical information. Thus, these recommendations regarding conveying statistical significance apply only to clinicians. In particular, the recommendations are to include confidence intervals in all cases, and note that p-values may also be appreciated. The example for clinicians and researchers shows the confidence intervals that indicate statistical significance at each time point and the p-value for the overall difference between groups over time. Both the confidence limits and p-values are explained in the figure legend.
Finally, in some instances, clinical trials report the proportion of patients in each arm meeting a responder definition. That is, the proportion of patients who might be improved, stayed the same, or worsened by some change score criterion. In cases where a proportion needs to be displayed, the recommendations are to use pie charts for patients. For clinicians and researchers, bar charts, pie charts, or stacked bar charts are all seen to be reasonable display options. We do note that the evidence supporting these recommendations is based on showing 2 pie charts, one for each treatment, with only 3 slices per pie chart. Showing more than 2 pie charts or showing more than 3 slices per pie might be more difficult to interpret. This slide shows example pie charts designed for patients, highlighting some specific attributes to aid interpretation of the display. Each pie slice is labeled directly with a specific percentage and whether improvement, no change or worsening is represented by the slice, thus negating the need for a legend. Also, the improved pie slice consistently starts at the 12 o'clock position. Recommendations for clinicians parallel those made for patients, with the addition of p-values for statistically significant between-arm differences in proportions and removal of color. Finally, since directionally is not an issue with the pie charts, there is no separation between the function domains and the symptom domains. As noted previously, stacked bar charts are also appropriate for displaying these data to clinicians and researchers. Note that again, data labels are used to annotate the proportions, and an easily accessible legend is replicated and presented in the same order as the stacked bars. To recap, ProData have enormous potential to promote patient-centered care, but for this potential to be realized, clinicians and patients need to be able to understand what the PRO scores mean. We used a modified Delphi consensus process to develop recommendations for PRO data display, and in doing so produced clear guidance for PRO data display to promote patient-centered care by optimizing accurate and meaningful PRO interpretation. This slide lists the papers that informed this presentation for those interested in further reading. Thank you again for your interest in the Proteus Consortium.